Good afternoon. Thanks for joining our monthly webinar. I'm very excited to announce that LA has retaken the top spot as the top Energy Star city in the country. Most Energy Star buildings of any city metropolitan area in the whole country. We had lost that title to Washington, D.C. for a period of time and back on top. That has implications, of course, for the competitive landscape and owners of real estate in LA, and that's what we'll be talking about today. Also through the lens of this benchmarking and disclosure ordinance that everybody's familiar with, not unique to LA. Couple of housekeeping items. As usual, the webinar will be recorded and available on the website. We'll also send around a copy of the slides and a link to the recording to everybody who registered, so you're free to share that with anyone who you think would like to see this, or just delete it. Lines will be muted. There will be plenty of time, and today we're going to have this be really interactive, I hope. We have a phenomenal guest speaker who I'll introduce in a moment, so we want to make today's webinar really two-way, so plenty of time for questions. Please submit your questions through a chat box on the right-hand side of the screen, I believe. And again, we'll have plenty of time for that. I'm Dave Hodgins, Executive Director of the LA Better Buildings Challenge, and our guest speaker today is Dan Winters. He's Head of Americas for GRESB, which stands for the Global Real Estate Sustainability Benchmark. Really brings a global institutional investor's perspective to this sustainability conversation, and I'll let him introduce himself a little bit later in the presentation before we get into the Q&A, but he is a wealth of knowledge, and I hope you'll take the opportunity to pick his brain about questions that you may have. So I'm going to start with some data. Everybody has heard, LEED buildings, Energy Star buildings, they're worth more money, they're better, more competitive. Well, it's true, and we like to refresh this data on an annual basis. This data comes from CoStar, which is, for those who don't know what that is, it's a database that a lot of people use, but specifically real estate brokers, commercial real estate brokers, for leasing and sales of commercial real estate. So it's a big database. We've got LEED and Energy Star certification being tracked in there for years now, along with other information about asking rents, the actual rents relative to those, whole bunch of other information, occupancy. It's not perfect, and Dan correctly pointed out it's not a perfect data set, but it's I think for our purposes a good resource to look at some general trends. And so don't hold me to these specific figures, but I think the trends are very illustrative. So I'm going to talk just through a couple slides about what the data is telling us about how Energy Star and LEED certified buildings perform financially relative to buildings that are not certified Energy Star or LEED. So as you can see here, rent and occupancy, or the converse of that, vacancy, better for the Energy Star and LEED buildings, and way better on the sales price per square foot. I'm going to share some hypotheses that I have about why some of these numbers are what they are, and would love, Dan, feel free to jump in at any time if you wanted to add any color or respond to anything, and we'll have time when we get to that.
Great, I will do the Q&A. Thank you. Yep, you got it.
Excellent. Excellent. So we see that the sales price per square foot on an Energy Star building is higher than for a LEED building, and controlling as much as we can for other factors. I think that's interesting, and my guess on why that might be is that Energy Star really focuses on energy, right? To get Energy Star certified, you have to have a score of a 75. To get LEED certified, you have to have a score of a 69. Last time I took my LEED exam. So an Energy Star building is, one can assume, better performing from an energy efficiency perspective than a LEED building, and that translates into savings for somebody, depending on how the leases are structured. It gets complicated. But anyway, lower utilities, apply a cap rate to that, it's worth more money. I think that's how some of that energy performance could be showing up in the numbers. Dan, if you have a different perspective,
yeah, well, let me. So you know, I look at these. They're both signals of asset quality. Energy Star, I call it a single issue voter. It's solely focused on energy. LEED is a multivariant rating, and it takes into account location, water efficiency, indoor environmental quality. So energy is a piece of that, but it looks at other aspects. And oftentimes you'll see, you know, where LEED buildings are also Energy Star certified. So there can be a blending of the two. Either way, by putting a building through the paces that it has to go through on Energy Star to, you know, have the 12-month look back on energy costs and consumption, really gets people to focus on those issues and those numbers. And oftentimes you see buildings get a score, right? The company that owns that building gets that score, and then they work to improve because, you know, real estate's a competitive thing, and they want to, you know, be the best that they can be with the building that they have in the marketplace. So that begets a lot of things, you know, focus on maintenance and deferred maintenance and things like that all feed into the energy equation. Either way, but let's go back to the original premise that Energy Star and LEED are signals of a high quality building, you know, hopefully a better building than just your standard building, and the numbers show it as you are pointing out here.
Right, right. And I like that, you know, the single issue voter, and that's why I think again that yes, that lower utility costs, and you're right. You know, LEED accounts for so many other things, and that single issue of energy, you know, that's a hard cost. And I think BOMA has a nice slide that I use sometimes that utilities are the single largest controllable cost in a building. You got a lot of other costs you can't really do much about, like insurance and landscaping, things like that. Okay, great. So this one starts to get really interesting, I think, Class B buildings, because I've always heard people say tenants in Class B buildings don't care about Energy Star or LEED. They're just looking at rent, and that's all they care about. And so we don't need to be doing that. This is a bit of a smaller sample set here. You see this is in the footnotes, 263 buildings in this sample set. But I think the trend here is to me even more kind of elucidating of this issue of energy costs being important. So here we don't see a rent premium on the Energy Star buildings, and I'm going to focus just on Energy Star since that's kind of the theme today. Same asking rent, or same rent per square foot, based on what CoStar says, as a standard Class B building in LA. So no rent premium. But look at the difference in vacancy. It's significant, almost a 10% difference in vacancy is huge. And then looking at the trend, the 5-year average, this is where my eyes really kind of popped out, was you see for standard, it really hasn't changed over the last 5 years. It's, you know, about the same, 15.5% or so. But in the Energy Star buildings, you've seen a decrease in vacancy over that 5-year time frame. And the last time we did this, it was even more pronounced, because that took into account data going back further prior to, well, really going back into the deeper part of the recession. And the difference in vacancy between Class B certified and Class B not certified was even more pronounced, and the trend was faster. But you know, to me, that signals that.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. No, keep going.
I was going to say, to me, this signals that tenants are looking at not just the face rent, but looking at, you know, all the costs, the total cost of occupancy, and if your bills are lower, it's a higher quality building, like you were saying, Dan. That's where we'll go. All other things
I jumped the gun.
Equal.
I was about to say it's a total occupancy cost story. Way to go.
Cool. Yeah, so even in Class B. And then this one is just, I was just curious, what if we kind of slice these numbers another way and try to look at value? So here we kind of did a mashup, and we've got Class A uncertified, that's the 294 per foot, vacancy 14.8, and we'll just assume that these three buildings, representative of their respective categories here, are all the same size, since everything's in per square foot for the rents and sales prices. You see the asking rent for Energy Star certified Class B. So now we're comparing Class A, like a nicer, better located building, all the factors that make a building Class A. It's got good parking, et cetera, amenities, relative to a Class B building means it has a worse location, not the types of amenities, et cetera. Slightly higher rent, see the numbers here. You would think that a Class A building would be worth more, but if you look at the gross rent that they're throwing off, and we're assuming the same size here, you see that the certified Class B buildings are actually throwing off more rent on a monthly basis than a Class A not certified building. So kind of putting the rent and occupancy or vacancy numbers together and applying it to a building of the same size, you see that these Class B buildings should actually be worth more than the Class A building, which I thought was kind of interesting. Dan is stunned.
All right, no, let's see what's next. Let's go to the next slide.
So the point is, I think the data is showing that there's a lot of factors involved, but there's some connection between energy performance, Energy Star score, certification, and rents and occupancy. It's the kind of the theme here. So so we came up with this report to kind of illustrate that. We call it the E3 report, like energy efficiency economics. But we put these together for certain meetings, and the logic is that if you aren't Energy Star certified, so this building it says current Energy Star score is 65. And we ask them what is their current asking rent, or we look it up in CoStar. The logic is that, and then their occupancy is 84%. The average occupancy for Energy Star buildings is 90. So, so the logic being that if you get certified, get that score from a 65 up to a 75 or higher, that your numbers should trend towards what the data is showing Energy Star buildings are getting. It's a simple, kind of logical connection that we're trying to draw. So, so then if we assume different levels of savings, and I'm looking at the blue graph here, if we assume 20% savings, the algorithm tells us you would get up to a 76. That's enough to get certified. 75 is the minimum. So if you could knock 20% off this building, you could get certified, and your rent and occupancy numbers should trend towards what Energy Star buildings are getting over time, as leases roll, et cetera. So there's opportunity to adjust those things. Same logic with occupancy. This building is 84% occupied now. Energy Star buildings are 90% occupied. So if they're able to knock that 20% off, get up to get certified, occupancy should increase towards that, what the data, again, is telling us Energy Star buildings are getting. We're focusing here more on how are you making money by reducing your energy use as opposed to saving money, which saving money is nice too, but it's a complicated story, trying to measure these projects, who do the benefits flow to. But this is pretty simple, trying to draw that connection between performance verification of that vis-a-vis certification and rent and occupancy, which is the purpose of an office building. Right? Then we can translate that into dollars. So if the occupancy increases by a certain amount, and we can change whatever these assumptions are going to be based off of what the owner or property manager wants to see, what they think could happen by over time, achieving certified and moving towards those numbers. But basically multiplying the increase in rent times the projected occupancy. And what is that increase? So this is annual revenue. Again, instead of focusing on, we haven't even talked about savings here, but we're saying here, you're earning another, in the low scenario, $240,000 a year. What would you spend? What would it make sense to spend to get that kind of money back every year? Top line. You could do the same logic on rent. So this one is showing the current asking rent on this property, and this is a real building, by the way, is $2 a square foot. Energy Star buildings, $2.15 a month. So same logic. If they can knock 20% off the building, the blue graph is the same as before. Their score would go up to 76. They could get a plaque, and then they could say, well, we're Energy Star now. It's a better building. We're running it better. It costs you less to operate. Overall, they could bump up that rent a little bit. And, so here we assume, some different changes here, 5%, 7%, 9%, and change that. In the high scenario or medium scenario there, that's 14 cents increase. That's basically bringing it up to parity with what we're seeing in Energy Star buildings now, at $2.15, right? And this would be over time, of course. What does that work out to in dollars? It's another 213. And we're doing these analyses are separate. So this increased gross annual rent from increased rent does not even account for the occupancy point that we were just going through before. So it's actually even more than this. So why do I want to spend money on efficiency projects? It's because you're going to make more money, and it shows up here in the data. So then only then at the very end we figure out, okay, how much could you afford to spend, basically working backwards. If you achieved that 20% savings, we stick with that example, that was the one that would get you to the 76 Energy Star score up from your 65. Now 20% off the building, doable in a lot of buildings, even really good buildings I've seen can do that. 20%, pretty easy. If we know their utility bill, in this case we do, that works out to about 100 grand. Dollar savings is 20%. So you'd be saving $100,000 a year, someone is, if you increase your efficiency enough to get that plaque. If you look at the estimated life cycle savings, we can, have transparent assumptions about that. Apply a cap rate, basically what we've done here, and we can change that. That's telling you how much money you could afford to spend to achieve those savings and basically hit that rate of return. I would venture to say that you could probably achieve the 20% savings for a lot less than $2 million. That would be a huge, or excuse me, than $975,000. That would be a big project. So kind of working backwards to make the connection and back into, okay, what could you support just through savings to achieve, what level of investment could be supported, through the savings to achieve that, get the plaque, and then you get the rent and occupancy. So that's all kind of pre-benchmarking and disclosure. That's been happening. We're looking at the 5-year trend, and we've been looking at this for quite a while now. It's been consistent. Now, and I think everybody's aware of this, lots of cities in the U.S., and Dan, I know you have a global perspective on this, are requiring benchmarking and disclosure of that information, and some even go beyond that. So, New York has additional requirements for audits and retrocommissioning and lighting retrofits. So does San Francisco, and so does L.A. LA's law, and I think everybody's familiar with this by this point, annual benchmarking. So the next due date for that is June 1st of this year for the 2017 data. And then starting next year, the performance phase, they call it, starts to kick in. And that requires energy and water audits and implementation of retrocommissioning measures on a cycle, on a 5-year cycle that's determined by the property's parcel number. So, so that starts next year for certain buildings, and public disclosure of the summary data, so the scores, and that's happening already. Building and safety, you know, as it said it would in the ordinance. So building and safety has this this function up, this map function up on their website, and that's the link to it. So you can actually look by property address and see the compliance status and benchmarking metrics. And then it's also shown in the mayor's open data platform. So there's all kinds of stuff in here, but that's the link to see the whole list of all the buildings that have complied or not, you know, all the covered buildings, and the summary statistics. So all that's to say that this transparency is now there. It really wasn't before. So we're already seeing this trend towards higher rents, higher occupancy, even in Class B buildings. It translates into sales prices, and that was all kind of before any of this happened. As I mentioned, and kind of the title of the webinar, LA is now, again, the #1 city in terms of ENERGY STAR certified buildings, number of them, 716. So with this transparency and this kind of indicators being tracked in sources like CoStar that people see, and even more transparent now with the city actually disclosing this stuff, what does that mean? What does that mean for that trend that we've been talking about? And so with that, you know, kind of stage setting, I wanted to kind of turn to you, Dan, and just, well, first, if you could just, you know, tell us a little bit about yourself and your organization, and then wanted to kind of just get your reactions to some of the stuff we talked about, and some questions about related to that, you know, and broadening the conversation a little bit. So
sure.
Well,
so first off,
well,
so the analysis that you put forward is really strong, because it bins things into two groups. You either have these signals, ENERGY STAR with lead as sort of in the sidecar, you know, or not. And the, you know, compelling nature of being in that group is, you know, teased out within the data set of, you know, a better economic proposition and value for the tenants and for the owner when they, you know, are collecting the cash flow on a yearly basis, or when they go to transact that building. So, you know, it's been a great analysis. So for the folks on the phone that I have not, you know, touched or been out to, you know much about GRESB. So my name is Dan Lynchers. I'm the head of Americas with GRESB. In the U.S., we kind of call it GRESB. It's tomato. It stands for the Global Real Estate Sustainability Benchmark. It was set up that way in 2009. And we work with private equity investors, you know, big pension plans in the state of California. CalPERS is one of our members. We've got roughly 80 institutional investors around the globe. And they will make investments, significant investments, in private equity funds. And those fund managers then buy buildings with that capital. And they also invest in real estate investment trusts, you know, listed property companies. And we'll talk about one of the LA ones in just a second. So what we do is, and we've been doing this since 2009, is we have a framework that is out there and used on an annual basis by property companies and funds to benchmark themselves on environmental, social, and governance practices. And that's, you know, to my earlier comments about whether it's ENERGY STAR being a single issue voter and LEED being a multivariant, right? GRESB is also a multivariant. Environmental, social, and governance issues, it comes across in 42 different indicators that our assessment covers. And, you know, one of those things is, can you get the energy, water, waste, and greenhouse gas emissions for your portfolio? It's one of the questions in GRESB. And it's a difficult question, particularly when, you know, these are large companies and large funds that participate and benchmark themselves. So when that question is posed to these folks, if you're sitting on a portfolio of 8 buildings, well, okay, you know, I think that we can, you know, pick up the phone and call 8 different property managers and have them put their energy into, or their utility data into Energy Star and roll that up and be able to report that on a portfolio level. When you're sitting on a portfolio of several hundred buildings, well, that's a harder challenge, definitely. So GRESB has been instrumental in pushing the institutional real estate market forward to be able to collect greater data on their buildings. And one of the tools that they use, particularly here in the U.S., well, North America, great, because Canada also uses Energy Star, is the Energy Star platform. So, are there some other things you want me to talk about here with GRESB, or lead me a little bit here, David?
No, I think that's helpful. So, global perspective, working with large, very sophisticated investors. So why do you think real estate investors have made sustainability and environmental metrics such a focal point? And kind of, how would you describe kind of the profile of the investors that are involved with GRESB?
Well, I think it's it's an economic story. It's about what you learn in MBA school, MBA 101. You maximize your inputs and you minimize your waste. And you made the point about energy being a controllable expense, the #1 controllable expense. So that's an input that can affect the bottom line. Occupancy is another key input that affects the bottom line. So to the extent that you are running a solid building and you have investors that are part of your capital structure, you're delivering them a better return. And hopefully, the idea is that you deliver that better return with less risk. So what institutional investors care about is they care about returns, but they also care about risk-adjusted returns. And buildings that are put through those paces and use programs like Energy Star and pursue certifications like LEED and have water sense and the other things that are out there that really signal what's a good building. Institutional investors care about that a lot because those are better buildings for them to hold, and they typically want to hold for the long term. So it's an income story for them, and they want a reliable income stream, and that comes from good energy management, good water management, and great occupancy, and tenants that don't want to leave. Tenants that want to renew and re-up. Yeah, go ahead.
Absolutely. No, I was just agreeing. I think absolutely, and I just wanted to underline that point you made about risk. I like to say that this is about modernizing buildings, right? I think we talk so much about efficiency. It sounds a little bit esoteric, a little bit puritanical, or like energy audit. Not a nice word, but yeah, we're making these buildings function better, right? They're less risky in all the ways that you mentioned.
Well, the reality is, if you don't benchmark yourself, you don't really have any context for how you're doing. And so if you're benchmarking a building on energy, or you're benchmarking your portfolio against best practices that are globally in the industry, which is what GRESB is all about, it draws a line in the sand and says, here's where you are as your organization. And when you get benchmarked, you benchmark yourselves against a peer set. And that peer set is new information that you can't get in any other way. And that helps level set, contextualize, and allows conversations to happen around issues. If you step into an Energy Star benchmark and you knock it out of the park because you've been in a great building and you've just never engaged this program before, and you score 75 or higher, say you score an 88 or a 90, wow, that's great. That affirms all of the super things that you've been doing, and you're going to want to keep that up. To the extent that you get an Energy Star score that doesn't, that's low, perhaps doesn't comport to your aspirations for your asset, then that also is great information. It allows for conversations to happen on operational changes that might be applicable, and it also brings focus in on things like deferred maintenance, moving CapEx expenses, and drives that conversation and drives action. And that stuff doesn't happen overnight. It takes time. and but it requires a well-executed plan, and having that information from which to build that plan around is the key, driver of benchmarking.
Right, absolutely. And so I think that's definitely true, and it shows up in some of the data that we were looking at earlier. And as I was saying, that was kind of pre-ordinance or pre-local law, depending which market you're talking about. So do you think that this kind of increased transparency or disclosure will have, how do you think that plays in? How will that have an effect?
Well, transparency, I think it totally will. So transparency on material metrics are what make markets work. The U.S. is a capitalism-driven society, right? It's a market-driven society and economy. So in order for markets to work, you need transparency on rent, you need transparency on expenses, you need transparency on the management quality and a whole host of other things that inform decisions that happen on what I call financial moments of truth. And those moments of truth are when you're touring a potential tenant and you want them to sign a lease and you're negotiating. It also happens when you're going to your banker to secure a loan or a refinance. Mm-hmm. And it also happens when you sell. So, transparency is what drives markets. What I've observed is, because now you were using that CoStar data, you can go into CoStar and you can sort based upon Energy Star lead buildings. And over what I'll say the last real estate cycle, probably the last half real estate cycle, the phenomena is that the credit tenants that most landlords desire are looking for, a good occupancy cost, a well-run building, and they're using Energy Star and LEED as a litmus test. So those are the buildings that get more foot traffic when it comes to tours, and they're in play. They're in the game and have more opportunity to attract those tenants that they want, that the buildings want.
What do you think are some other trends that come into play here? I hear people talking a lot about millennials and kind of attracting talent. Are you hearing that kind of discussion as it relates to kind of foot traffic and attracting tenants?
Yeah, well, I think employers want to be the employer of choice to attract talent, and that's pretty key. And you can do that in a number of different ways, right? And so you can do it with LEED and Energy Star. You can also do it with having cool space and flexibility like WeWorks offers. And more of the tenants that are signing up for WeWorks are actually traditional tenants that are utilizing that for flex space. So there's different ways to go about it. The reality is, it's the old saying that your talent walks out the door, you want them to come back the next day. In order to do that, you need to provide them a workspace that is, enlivening and productive and stimulating and safe and all of those things. So to the extent that those attributes are encompassed in better buildings, well, it just, it sort of drives that conversation.
Well, I'd like to open it up if anyone has any questions or observations on anything that we've talked about so far. Now's the time. Please feel free to type those in on the side of the screen, and we'll try to get to all of them.
So while we're waiting for some questions, I thought I might offer the story of a Los Angeles-based, a pretty sizable Los Angeles-based company, which is Kilroy, right? They are a publicly traded REIT based in Los Angeles with some holdings down by LAX and other areas of the metropolitan area and up and down the West Coast. And, Kilroy has been participating in GRESB since, I think, the beginning, certainly early on, at least since 2012. And over the years, their scores have gone from, in the middle of the pack to now being the #1 listed property company in North America on the GRESB assessment. And one of the things that they did in order to go from middle of the pack to top dog is they mandated that all of the buildings needed to use Energy Star and get that data into that platform, benchmark themselves, and set about an improvement plan. And it allowed the company to sort of bifurcate their portfolio. They could figure out which ones were the top buildings that were humming along, great operational attributes, because it's not always a CapEx game, it's an operations game. They could also determine which buildings were the ones that weren't doing so well. And they did a couple things. One, they started to get the building engineers to have a friendly competition with one another, who's best, and would recognize the best ones. They did some cross-training, and they took the engineers from some of the better buildings and brought them in to help the ones that were not doing well, to talk about techniques that could be applied from one building to the other. And as a result, the whole portfolio started to do better. And, you know, it's not just on energy, because when you're having those kind of conversations, you're focused on water, you're focused on, you know, all sorts of things, you know, good maintenance practices. And then, you know, they started looking for opportunities to do, you know, sort of bulk purchases and retrofits for LED lighting, and started talking about opportunities for on-site renewables, and the whole conversation just really started to make good, solid leaps forward. And that took us, you know, it's a 4 to 5 year period, and the results now, you know, they bear themselves out. They're #1 on GRESB. They've got all those buildings in Energy Star. I don't know how many and the square footage. Pretty sure it's on their website. But it's a really solid success story, and it's a homegrown one in LA. I thought that would be useful to the folks on the line.
Yeah, absolutely. Kilroy is a great example, and they are a Better Building Challenge partner, and we love working with them. Great, I mean, so many great stories, ideas coming out of there. A good question came in here. Another term, you know, that's starting to get a lot more play and that we talk about a lot is resilience. About, you know, efficient buildings are more resilient. I wanted to hear a little bit more about if that's something that GRESB is looking at, that issue of resiliency, and how that kind of relates to the issue of risk-adjusted returns and prudent risk management.
So because GRESB is a portfolio level tool, you know, we analyze portfolios, but portfolios are made up of buildings. We do offer so this year we've launched and added what we call the resilience module. It's an additional set of questions that our participants can engage in. And the idea behind the GRESB resilience module is to understand the portfolio's ability to withstand what we call shocks and stressors to the portfolio and continue to operate and deliver, you know, financial returns to the investors. And because resilience can mean a lot of different things. It can mean, well, can it withstand an earthquake? Is it going to fall over? Is it in a 100-year floodplain that's actually now flooding every 10 years? So those are, you know, asset level questions. When the GRESB resilience module is, you know, at hand, we're asking portfolio managers, what's your approach when it comes to thinking about your assets? Have you looked throughout the portfolio to assess it against some of these shocks and stressors? And then what's the plan? Do you have a plan in place should some of these events happen to a subset of your assets? What happens? What do you do? Can you know, get these things back online pretty quickly? You know, and what are the techniques? That's what GRESB is meant to tease out. And when we do something like this, it really focuses the industry's attention on these issues. And we don't come at it with a bunch of solutions. What we try to do is get the industry to focus on these things and let good solutions bubble to the top. Kilroy has some, you know, great solutions on this. So does Boston Properties, and that's an East Coast, West Coast thing. So it's not for us to go and tell the industry what to do. It's for the industry to, respond and say, hey, this is what we're doing, and then to cross-pollinate good ideas.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, it's a big conversation here, of course. We're earthquake country here, and it's not if, but when, and what will happen. And then, with this record heat, we just had another record heat day last week. It's kind of underreported, but because of the Aliso Canyon blowout, this was 2 years ago now, I think that got some national attention. They can't put as much natural gas in the ground anymore. They can't store as much gas there, and that's the gas they use to fire up the peaker plants that come on those really hot days when everyone's cranking up their AC. So I think this issue of efficiency and resiliency is really coming together here. So it's really encouraging and inspiring to see that GRESB is putting that question to industry and getting them focused on it, because I think those dots haven't been connected for a lot of people.
Well, think about where that goes. So if that plant can't get fired up on a peak load day, then the pricing mechanism comes into play. So peak load price goes up, and that's what sets the rate for the month. To the extent that you're running an efficient building and you can either shave load at these moments because you're doing demand response, or you just have a great building, then your rate for that month is going to be less than the next guy, which again flows straight down to the bottom line. And, that's what your investor partners want. That's what the shareholders want. That's what, limited partners in a private equity fund would like to see their investment managers do on their behalf.
Absolutely. We got to figure out how to work that into our report here. But definitely, I think that's just, another example of how having an efficient, modern building creates value, preserves value beyond just the month-to-month, energy savings, right? And
but a modern building doesn't mean a new building, right? I want to clarify that, because I heard you use that word, and a lot of times people equate them, and that's not necessarily true. There are some Energy Star buildings, especially not in your city, in New York, that date back to the 30s. So it doesn't have to be new and shiny.
Yeah, absolutely. And I should have, thank you for catching that. I should have said modernized, a building that's been made modern, whether new or existing. Yes, absolutely. And I like that you plugged demand response. That's actually our next webinar topic. So DWP continues to put more resources into that program, meaning dollars. And so anybody that hasn't looked at that program definitely should. And there's a lot of misconceptions too, kind of on that theme of you don't have to be a new building to be modern. You don't have to have, a full building automation system, zone level DDC and you don't have to have all of that to participate in the program. And we did a webinar last year with Hines, and they were talking about some examples of buildings. They have their whole portfolio in the program. They had all pneumatics throughout the building, but they're able to participate and through the process of putting their building through the paces, to borrow another term from Dan, figured out a bunch of stuff that they should just be doing all the time to reduce their demand charge, which, as Dan also said, effectively in DWP territory sets your price for the year, not just the month. So that's super important. I'm glad you brought that up as well.
It's funny you brought up Hines. I was in Houston on Monday, and I was in their office, and now I'm looking at my phone at the lucite that I took a photo of on their wall, right, celebrating 10 years of Energy Star Partner of the Year. I mean, Hines has been doing a great job with their portfolio and all their buildings. So,
tremendous. Another one that just get so many great ideas and stories coming from those guys. Excellent. Any other questions? Great. Well, Dan, I think we'll give you back 15 minutes here. And thank you so much for making the time today, and really appreciate it. And thanks everybody for tuning in. It was great. And again, next month we'll be talking more about demand response. So thank you, everybody.
Great. Thanks for having me, David. Take care, everyone.